Cutting a sewing pattern on the bias basically means cutting it diagonally in relation to the fabric's salvage edge. A bias cut causes the edges to behave similar to stretch knit fabrics, so they have to be treated quite differently than regular lengthwise cuts. Well, today I'll show you a few techniques to aligning and sewing bias seams, whether you are sewing a bias cut edge to a lengthwise cut edge or bias edges together. When a pattern is cut on the bias or diagonally in relation to the salvage edge, it results in a stretchy draped fabric cut. While the cut fabric edges may look like those of a regular straight cut, bias edges behave more like knits, stretching in the seam alignment and sewing process. The trick to sewing bias edges is to handle them gently, lay them flat on the table in the alignment process, and always hand baste them prior to machine stitching. When sewing a bias cut garment, you may find yourself in two common scenarios: sewing a bias edge to another bias edge, or sewing a bias edge to a lengthwise cut edge. When sewing a bias edge to a lengthwise edge, the two will behave completely different in the sewing process. The bias edge will stretch while the straight lengthwise cut will not. The trick to aligning these two edges is in carefully placing the bias edge on top of the straight one and matching them inch by inch such that they maintain the same length throughout. To pin a bias seam edge to a straight one, start by matching both top and bottom ends of the seam edges first. During this process, always keep the bias edge on top of the straight one, and if space allows, keep the fabric layers flat on the table. Next, carefully align the remainder of the edges together by gently placing the bias edge on top of the straight one. Be careful not to stretch the bias edge in the process. Insert pins perpendicular to the edges as you carefully match them. Apply a hand basting stitch to add extra stability. Make sure you remove the pins once the edges have been basted. When machine stitching, the bias cut layer should always be facing up, and extra care should be taken to prevent it from stretching and puckering under the presser foot. Sewing a bias edge to another bias edge is often similar to sewing a knit seam. If you're not careful, the seam can stretch out of shape. The trick to sewing a bias seam is not to stretch the edges in the alignment and pinning process. The easiest way to achieve this is to always lay your fabric pieces flat on the table. You should avoid hanging the edges off the table edge or lifting them up in the air as you align and pin. Insert pins through the top and bottom ends of the seam first. Next, carefully match the remainder of the bias cut edges to each other, being careful not to stretch them in the process. apply a wide basting stitch to keep the layers together. Hold the garment up and make sure that the seam is neither stretched out nor compressed in. Since bias seams are handled similar to knits, use a shorter stitch length in the machine stitching process.